The morning Harlan Briggs came to collect, he didn't knock. He walked straight through Mara Ellison's front door like he owned it, because in 3 days, he would. He stood in the middle of her kitchen, looked at the 4 children sitting at the table with their half-eaten breakfast, and said, without lowering his voice, "You've got until Friday. After that, I'm putting your furniture in the road." Nora was 4 years old. She didn't understand what he meant, but she stopped chewing. Caleb, 12, understood everything. Set down the pot she was holding and looked at this man, this banker, who had shaken her husband's hand at the funeral and called himself a friend, and she felt something go very quiet inside her. "My husband's account is empty," Harlan said. "Has been for months. You want to argue about it. Argue with the county clerk." He left without closing the door. That was the moment. Everything that came before the grief, the scrimping, the pretending things would get better stopped mattering. What was left was simpler and more brutal. 4 children, a door swinging open in the November wind, and a woman who had exactly 72 hours to figure out where her family would go. If you've ever stood in a kitchen and realized the floor had just dropped out from under you, this story is for you. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Stories like this one about ordinary people surviving impossible things come out every week, and I don't want you to miss a single one. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Mara Ellisonson had not planned to become the kind of woman people pitied. She had planned to grow old in the house where she and Daniel had painted the porch together the summer before Elsie was born. She had planned to watch Caleb grow tall enough to reach the top shelf without a stool, to teach Nora how to braid her own hair, to sit on that porch someday when her knees ached and feel like she had built something that lasted. Daniel died in October, 17 months before Harlan Briggs walked through her door. A fever that the doctor called routine until it wasn't. 3 days of chills and then nothing. Caleb had been the one to find him in the morning, and Mara had never forgiven herself for being asleep when it happened, though she knew, in the quieter hours, that there was nothing she could have done. Grief, she had learned, does not arrive all at once. It waits. It finds you when you're frying eggs or hanging laundry or listening to your youngest daughter laugh at something the cat did. It finds you and it squeezes, and then it lets go just long enough for you to think you might survive it. She thought she was surviving it. She was wrong about the money. Daniel had borrowed against the house in the last year of his life without telling her. Not recklessly, she understood that now, could trace the reasoning in the ledger she found afterward. Bad crop year, a horse that broke its leg, the doctor's bill from when Tommy got sick the winter before Daniel did. He had been trying to hold things together the same way she was holding things together now, with the same quiet desperation, and he had simply run out of time before he could tell her. The bank sent the first letter 2 weeks after the funeral. Mara read it 3 times before she understood what it said. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and did not move for a long time. She made payments for 7 months. She sold the horse. She sold Daniel's good saddle and his father's silver watch and the extra bedroom furniture. She took in sewing from 3 households in town and woke up before dawn to finish it so the children wouldn't see how bad things had gotten. But there is a point past which effort alone is not enough, and Harlan Briggs, who held the note on Daniel's loan, had decided that point was now. She had 2 days to make it matter. The morning after Harlan's visit, Mara sat down with the children and told them the truth. Not all of it. Not the part about how frightened she was. Not the part where she had lain awake until 3 in the morning going through every option she could think of, and finding most of them closed but enough. "We're going to leave," she said. "We'll need to pack what matters most." Elsie, you'll see, who was 9, and had inherited Mara's tendency to hold still when frightened, asked where they were going. "I don't know yet," Mara said, "but we're going together." Tommy, who was 7 and rarely quiet, said, "Can I bring my rocks?" "Some of them." "Which ones?" "The ones that fit in your coat pocket." Caleb didn't say anything. He looked at his mother the way he had been looking at her since Daniel died, like he was trying to calculate what she needed from him and whether he could provide it. He was too old for 12. That was the part that broke her heart more than anything Harlan Briggs had done. She had heard through the kind of word of mouth that moves through desperate people about a place called Blackwood Ranch, a man named Silas Blackwood who ran cattle in the high country north of Garrison. No wife, no children. A spread that a neighbor had called carefully a working situation for the right family. She didn't know what that meant. She didn't entirely trust it, but she had written a letter 3 weeks earlier in a moment of what she had told herself was just precaution, and Silas Blackwood had written back in 4 days, with 11 words. Come when you're ready. There's room. Bring the children. 11 words. She had read them so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. She didn't know if it was an answer, but it was the only door still open. They left on a Wednesday. Mara let the children say goodbye to the house quickly, the way you pull off a bandage. She didn't let herself look at the porch. She loaded what fit into the wagon blankets, the good pot, Elsie's books, Daniel's photograph in the frame with the cracked-cat corner, and she climbed onto the seat and kept her eyes on the road. It took 4 days to reach Garrison. The weather held barely. The second night, they camped under a stand of pines, and Tommy cried in his sleep, and Mara lay awake listening to the wind and trying to remember the last time she had felt certain about anything. Couldn't. In Garrison, she asked directions to Blackwood Ranch from a woman at the dry goods store. The woman looked at the children, then at Mara, and her expression did something complicated before she said, North Road, past the creek fork, left at the dead oak. Can't miss it. You know the man? Mara asked. Silas? The woman considered. Keeps to himself. Doesn't drink. Doesn't cause trouble. A pause. Doesn't say much. Mara thanked her and went back to the wagon. Doesn't say much, she thought. That could mean anything. The ranch appeared in late afternoon, when the light was going gold and the temperature was dropping fast. It was not what she had imagined. She wasn't sure what she had imagined, something more welcoming, perhaps, or more obviously lived in. What she saw was a solid, spare operation, a main house with a low porch, 2 outbuildings, a barn that needed paint on the east side, and a fence line that stretched farther than she could see in either direction. No flowers, no curtains visible through the windows. A place where someone worked, not a place where someone had learned to be comfortable. A man came out of the barn as she pulled the wagon to a stop. He was taller than she expected and older, somewhere in his late 40s, with the kind of face that had been weathered by too many winters into something spare and unreadable. He wore no expression she could easily name. He walked to the wagon without hurrying and stopped a few feet from the wheel and looked at her. Mrs. Ellison, he said. Not a question, Mr. Blackwood. He looked at the children, Caleb rigid on the bench. Beside her, Elsie and Tommy peering over the side, Nora asleep against a blanket in the back, and then he looked back at Mara. Something moved through his expression. She couldn't read it. How long a drive, he asked. 4 days. He nodded slowly. Then he looked at the children again, and this time something settled in his face that wasn't pity exactly, more like recognition. Come inside, he said. Let the children eat. He didn't say welcome. He didn't say, of course, or don't worry, or any of the things people say when they are trying to manage someone else's fear. He just turned and walked toward the house. Mara sat on the wagon seat for 3 seconds, maybe 4, and then she climbed down. The kitchen was plain and clean in the way things are clean when no one makes any mess in them. 1 table, 4 chairs, a stove that was clearly well maintained, a shelf of supplies along one wall, no photographs. No personal objects visible except a single mug on the counter and a pair of worn gloves on the windowsill. Silas put a pot on the stove without asking what anyone wanted. He sliced bread from a loaf that was 2 days old but not stale. He didn't speak much. He moved around his own kitchen the way a man moves, when he is used to silence efficiently, without ceremony. Caleb stood near the door with his arms crossed. Tommy immediately sat down at the table like he had always been there. Elsie looked at the shelf of books along the far wall, 3 of them. Just 3. But she looked at them the way she always looked at books, like they were a kind of breathing, and then she looked at the floor. Nora, still drowsy from sleeping in the wagon, made her way to a spot near the stove and sat down on the floor beside it. She looked up at Silas with the uncomplicated curiosity of a 4-year-old, and he glanced down at her. And for just a moment, something crossed his face that was almost startling. "She do that often?" he asked. "Sit near heat?" Mara said, since she could walk. He looked at Nora for another second, then went back to the stove. Mara stood in the middle of this sparse, quiet kitchen with her children distributed around her like she dropped them. And she understood something. She hadn't expected to understand this quickly. This man had no idea what he'd let through his gate, and neither, entirely, did she. Supper was beans and bread and dried apple, and it was the best meal the children had eaten in 2 months, which said more about the past 2 months than it did about the food. Silas ate without talking. Mara tried twice to open conversation about the ride up, about the weather turning, and got answers that were complete but brief. He wasn't rude. He wasn't cold. Exactly. He was simply a man who had spent a great deal of time alone and hadn't yet adjusted to the volume of 4 children filling a room. Tommy talked enough for everyone. He told Silas about the rocks in his pocket, about a jackrabbit they'd seen on the second day of travel, about a dream he'd had where a horse could talk, but only knew 3 words and kept saying them in the wrong order. Silas listened to all of this with an expression that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. After supper, when the children were settled in the back room, 2 beds between 4 of them, which was 2 more beds than they'd had the night before Margana came back to the kitchen. Silas was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, looking at nothing. She sat down across from him. "I need to know what this arrangement is," she said. "Not the version in the letter. The real one." He looked at her. "The real one is what I wrote. There's work here. The house needs people in it. I won't pretend otherwise. And in exchange? In exchange, you and your children have a roof and food through the winter. After that." He stopped. "After that, we see." Mara studied him. She was looking for the catch. People who made offers like this always had a catch. In her experience, a debt you didn't see coming. A condition attached to the generosity that only revealed itself later. Couldn't find one. Which frightened her more than if she had. "I need you to understand," she said, "that I have 4 children, and I will not put them in a situation that becomes Mrs. Ellison." She stopped. "I understand what you're afraid of," he said, not unkindly. "I'm not asking you to stop being afraid of it. I'm asking you to come inside and let us see what happens." She sat with that for a moment. "You live alone out here," she said. "A long time? 11 years. Why?" He looked at his coffee. "That's a longer conversation." She almost pushed. She didn't. "All right," she said finally. "We'll stay. For now." He nodded. He didn't say good or "I'm glad," or any of the reassurances she'd half expected. He just nodded and stood and rinsed his cup at the basin and said, "The outhouse is 30 feet back. Water comes from the well. It's good water. No rust. Wood's already cut for the week. Practical." She could work with practical. She said goodnight, and she went to check on her children, and she lay down beside Nora in the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling of a stranger's house and thought about the expression on Silas Blackwood's face when Nora had sat down next to his stove. Not annoyance, not calculation, something older and quieter than either of those things. She filed it away and didn't let herself think about what it might mean. In the other bed, Caleb was not asleep. She could tell by his breathing. He was lying still and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of an unfamiliar house, and she knew he was doing the same thing he'd been doing since October of last year, cataloging every possible threat, measuring every possible exit, keeping watch so that she didn't have to. She wanted to tell him he could stop. She didn't know yet if it was true. Outside, the Montana wind came down off the ridge and pressed against the walls of Blackwood Ranch, and somewhere in the barn, the horses shifted against the cold, and the night settled in around all 6 of them, one man, one woman. and 4 children who had not yet decided whether this place could hold them like a door had been left ajar, and none of them were quite sure yet who was going to close it. The first week at Blackwood Ranch did not feel like a beginning. It felt like a held breath. Mara woke before anyone else each morning, as she had trained herself to do in the months after Daniel died, when the pre-dawn silence was the only time she could think without someone needing something from her. She would dress in the dark, go to the kitchen, and start the stove. The routine of it helped. The stove needed kindling split a certain way, and the flue had a particular drag that meant you had to hold the damper open longer than felt necessary. And these small mechanical facts gave her mind something to do, besides calculate everything that could still go wrong. Silas was usually already up. She hadn't expected that. She'd assumed she would have the kitchen to herself in those early hours, and the first morning she came around the corner to find him sitting at the table with his coffee and a piece of tack he was mending. She stopped in the doorway, and they looked at each other with the particular awkwardness of 2 people who had not yet negotiated the terms of sharing a space. He stood up, which she hadn't expected either. "I can go," he said. "You don't have to. It's your kitchen." "It's the kitchen," he said, and sat back down. She wasn't sure what to make of that distinction. She filed it under things to consider later and went about starting breakfast. They worked in the same room in silence for the better part of an hour, and it was not comfortable exactly, but it was not unbearable, which was more than she had hoped for. He finished the tack and moved outside. She finished the porridge and woke the children. The day began the way. Days begin when you are new somewhere and not yet sure of the rules carefully, with a great deal of attention paid to small things. The children adapted in the uneven way. Children do, each according to their own particular nature. Tommy adapted fastest. Tommy adapted to everything fast. It was one of the things about him that both delighted and occasionally exhausted Mara, this inability to maintain distrust for longer than about 40 minutes. By the second day, he had found the horse barn and established himself as someone who had opinions about horses, none of which were based on any actual experience with horses. Silas, to his credit, did not tell him he was wrong. He simply said, "You want to learn to brush one down?" And Tommy said yes with a volume that startled a nearby crow off its fence post, and that was the beginning of that. Elsie's adaptation was quieter and more internal. She had found the 3 books on the shelf, a survey of Montana geography, a farming almanac from several years back, and a collection of short stories by an author Mara didn't recognize, and she had asked Silas, with the careful politeness she used. With adults, she hadn't yet assessed whether she was allowed to read them. Silas had looked at her for a moment, then said, "They're just sitting there." Elsie took that as a yes. She read the short stories collection twice through in the first week, and then she started on the almanac, because she was the kind of child who read almanacs, and Mara loved her so fiercely for it that it sometimes made her chest hurt. Nora continued to follow Silas. This was the development that surprised Mara most, because Nora was generally not a child who attached easily to strangers. She had a long assessment period, usually involving sustained staring from a safe distance, before she decided someone was acceptable. She had apparently completed this assessment sometime during supper on the first night and moved directly to following him around the property at a distance of approximately 4 feet. He didn't encourage it. He also didn't discourage it. He simply went about his work and let her trail behind him, and occasionally, when he stopped to do something that required 2 hands, he would narrate what he was doing in a flat, matter-of-fact voice, not because he thought she needed an explanation, but because the silence otherwise seemed to bother him, less than Mara had expected the following would. She heard him once explaining to Nora the correct way to close a stall latch so the horse couldn't work it open. "You push and then turn," he said. "Not turn and push. Push first." Nora said, "Why?" "Because the latch is stiff at the base." "Why? Because it's old." "Why is it old?" A pause. "Because I haven't replaced it yet." "Why?" Another pause, longer this time. "I'll add it to the list." Mara, who had been standing around the corner of the barn not entirely by accident, pressed her hand over her mouth. Caleb watched all of this and said nothing. He was present at meals, present at whatever task Mara assigned him, present in the physical space of the ranch, in the way that a person can be present without actually being there. He kept himself slightly apart from whatever was happening, from Tommy's enthusiasm about the horses, from Elsie's quiet contentment with the books, from Nora's unself-conscious attachment to the rancher who fed them. He was 12 years old, and he had decided that Blackwood Ranch was a temporary situation, and he was not going to let himself forget that. Mara watched him the way she had been watching him for 17 months and felt the familiar helplessness of loving someone you cannot reach. At the end of the first week, Silas asked Caleb to help him repair a section of fence line on the north pasture. Caleb looked at him with the expression he used for everything at the ranch flat, measuring, not hostile but not open either, and said, "All right." They were gone most of the day. When they came back, Caleb went to wash up without comment, and Silas came into the kitchen and poured himself a cup of water and stood there drinking it, and Mara looked at him and tried to read his face. "How'd he do?" she asked. "Fine," Silas said. "Did he talk?" "Not much." "Did you?" Silas considered this. "I showed him how to set a post properly." He watched. He did it right the second time, and the fence is fixed. Mara looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression that said he was not being evasive. He was simply reporting what had happened, and what had happened was that the fence was fixed. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and went back outside. That night, after supper, Caleb sat beside her while she mended a tear in Tommy's coat, and he said, without looking up from the boot he was oiling, "He doesn't waste words, does he?" "No," Mara said. A silence. "Dad did," Caleb said. "Talk through everything. Even things that didn't need talking through." Mara kept her needle moving. "Your father could make a story out of watering the garden." Caleb almost smiled. She saw the edge of it before he pulled it back. "Yeah," he said. "He could." She didn't push past that. There was something there, some small cracking of the wall Caleb had built, and she knew from experience pushing at it directly would only make him rebuild faster. She just kept sewing and let the silence sit between them like a third person they both knew. The second week brought cold that had teeth. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in a single night, and the morning came up gray and biting, with a wind off the ridge that made the walk from the house to the barn feel punishing. Silas had apparently known this was coming. He'd spent 2 days before it arrived, laying in extra feed and checking the cattle, and Mara had watched him work with the efficiency of someone who had survived enough Montana winters to treat them like an adversary he understood. She had not grown up in this kind of weather. She was from further south, from flatter country, and the particular violence of a mountain cold snap was something she had no experience managing. The first morning of it, she went to the barn to check on a heifer that had been off her feed the day before and came back inside with her hands. So cold she dropped the water bucket on the kitchen floor. Silas appeared from the hallway. He looked at her hands. Without saying anything, he went to the shelf by the door and got a pair of work gloves, men's gloves, too large, and set them on the table in front of her. "These are yours," he said. She looked at them. "I can't take your I have another pair," he said, and went back down the hallway. She stood there, holding the gloves for a moment before she put them on. They were warm from having been inside. She stood at the kitchen table in a stranger's work gloves, feeling something she couldn't immediately name and didn't want to look at directly, and then Tommy came in from the back room, demanding to know what was for breakfast, and the moment dissolved. But she didn't give the gloves back. The cold settled in and stayed. The days took on a rhythm that was partly Silas's existing routine and partly Mara's domestic organization layering over it, and the result was something neither of them had designed, but that worked. She managed the house, the meals, the children's lessons. He managed the livestock, the outbuildings, the constantly growing list of repairs that a working ranch produces. They crossed paths in the kitchen, in the mornings, and at supper, and occasionally mid-afternoon when one or the other had a practical question that needed answering. She noticed he was a man who did not ask for help easily. Not from pride exactly, but from habit, from 11 years of doing everything himself and having built a system that accommodated one person. When something required two sets of hands, he would usually engineer a workaround rather than ask. The first time she saw him trying to hold a beam in place, while simultaneously driving a nail into it, bracing the beam with his shoulder at an angle that looked genuinely painful, she walked over and held the beam. He looked at her. "I've got it," he said. "I can see that," she said. "Hold still," he drove the nail. She lowered the beam. He said nothing for a moment. "Thank you," he said finally. "You're welcome." She went back inside. He stood there for a second, she suspected, before continuing, because she heard the next nail go in about 15 seconds later, and there was a pause before it that had not been there before. Caleb's thaw, when it came from a direction Mara had not anticipated. It was a Thursday afternoon, the third week, when one of the younger horses, a gray mare named, somewhat unimaginatively, Gray, a name that Tommy had tried repeatedly and unsuccessfully to upgrade, got her back leg caught in a section of broken fence wire that no one had seen was loose. The wire had wrapped itself around her lower leg in a way that, if she panicked and pulled, would cut her badly. Silas was on the far north pasture, 40 minutes away. Mara was in the house. Tommy was with her. Nora was napping. Caleb was the one who found the mare. He came to the door of the house and said, his voice deliberately flat in the way it got when he was frightened, "The gray horse is caught in some wire." Mara dried her hands. "How bad?" "She's not panicking yet, but she will. We have to wait for—" "We can't wait," Caleb said. "She'll cut herself if she starts to pull." He was right, and she knew he was right. And she also knew neither of them had done this before. She went to the barn, found the wire cutters on the nail where she'd seen Silas hang them, and went with Caleb to the mare. Gray was trembling but still, which meant she was afraid, but not yet gone into full flight instinct. Caleb stood at her head and put his hand on her neck and talked to her low, steady, not reassuring exactly but present, the way Silas talked to the horses, which meant Caleb had been paying more attention than Mara had realized. The mare's ears swiveled. Her breathing didn't slow, but her body stopped coiling. Mara crouched near the leg and looked at the wire. It had gone around twice and was caught on itself. The wrong cut would loosen it in a way that would cause it to spring, and she'd lose skin, or worse. She had to do this right the first time. She made 2 cuts. The wire fell away. The mare stepped forward, tested the leg, and then stood there shivering. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Caleb exhaled, a long, shaking breath that he immediately tried to disguise by turning his face away. "Good job with the wire," he said, still not looking at her. "Good job with the horse," she said. He crouched down and looked at the mare's leg. "Not cut? No." "Okay." He stood up. He didn't say anything else for a moment. "Then how'd you know which wire to cut?" She paused. "I didn't. I looked at where the tension was and made the best guess I could." He looked at her. Something in his face was different than it had been. Not open, not warm, but less defended than usual. "Does that work?" he asked. "Just guessing?" "Sometimes," she said. "Sometimes it doesn't. That's the part nobody tells you when you're 12. He looked at the mare again. "What do they tell you?" "That guessing is the same as not knowing." "But it's not. A good guess is built out of everything you've already seen." She looked at him. "Kept that horse still, Caleb. That's not luck. That's everything you've been watching for 3 weeks." He didn't answer. But he didn't deflect either. He just stood there with it. That evening, when Silas came back and found the wire cut and the mare uninjured, he asked what had happened. Mara told him. He listened. Then he looked at Caleb across the supper table. "You kept her head," Silas said. Caleb shrugged. "That's not nothing," Silas said. Most grown men would have spooked her worse trying to help. Caleb stared at his plate, but the set of his jaw was different than it had been that morning. November deepened into something serious. The land changed. The color went out of everything except the sky, which turned a particular shade of gray-white that felt less like a color and more like a condition. Cattle moved closer to the barn on their own instinct. The horses grew rough-coated and restless. Silas had told her in the second week that this winter was going to be harder than last year, and she had filed this information in the practical part of her mind where she kept things she needed to act on. But now, watching the sky and feeling the quality of the cold, she understood it differently. This was not the kind of cold you outlasted by wearing more layers. This was the kind that planned to stay. She started stretching the pantry supplies without telling Silas, cutting portions just slightly, making meals that looked complete and weren't quite. She'd done this before in the last months at the house, and she was better at it than she wanted to be. She knew how much a child's portion could be reduced before they started waking up hungry. She knew which meals felt filling longer. She knew how to take a ham bone and produce 3 different meals from it over the course of a week. What she didn't know was whether the wood supply would hold. She asked Silas about it on a Tuesday evening after the children were in bed. He was at the table with the ranch ledger, which she had learned was his version of how she lay awake at night, his way of sitting with problems and going through them methodically. "The wood," she said. "How much do we have?" He looked up. "Enough for 6 weeks hard use." "How many weeks of hard cold?" A pause. "Could be 8. She sat down. "What do you usually do?" "I've always cut enough before now," he said. This year he stopped. He looked at the ledger, then back at her. "I didn't expect to need more." She understood. He had calculated for 1 person. He had not recalculated when 4 children and a woman arrived. "We can cut more," she said. "Ground's frozen now. Easier to haul from the standing deadfall on the East Ridge. It's a half-day's work for 2 people. "Tell me what to do," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You don't have to, Mr. Blackwood." She kept her voice even. "I am not going to sit in this house while you solve problems I'm part of causing. Tell me what to do." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly more like reassessment. "All right," he said. "Saturday." They went on Saturday, the 2 of them, with the draft horse and a sledge. East Ridge was a 40-minute ride, and they did it mostly in silence, which she was becoming more comfortable with. The deadfall was there, as he'd said, 3 large pines that had come down in a summer storm, already dry enough to split clean. They worked for 5 hours. She had never split wood before, and the first hour was genuinely humbling, her swings landing wrong, the maul bouncing back from knots in ways that made her wrists ache. He watched her once, said nothing, then came over and adjusted her grip. "Different angle," he said. "Let the weight do it. You're muscling it." She tried again, the log split clean. "There," he said, and went back to his own section. By the 3rd hour, she had a system. By the 5th hour, she was tired in a physical way that was different from exhaustion, it was honest. Tiredness, the kind that came from doing something real. And she hadn't felt that particular flavor of tired in a long time. On the ride back, the sledge loaded and the horse's breath clouding in the cold air, he said, without looking at her, "You're stronger than you look." She considered this. "That's either a compliment or an insult." "Compliment," he said. "Then thank you." A silence. "I didn't grow up soft," she said. "People think," she stopped. "People look at a woman with 4 children, and they think soft. Soft didn't get me here." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "No, it didn't." She looked at the side of his face. The winter light was flat and gray and honest. He was looking at the trail ahead of them, and his expression was the contained, unreadable thing it usually was, but there was something underneath it that she was beginning to learn to see. He was not cold. He was careful. There was a difference. The children had made supper by the time they got back. Elsie had taken charge, which meant it was a more organized undertaking than when Tommy helped, and there was a pot of something on the stove that smelled like the broth Mara had left instructions for when away. Caleb had come in from the barn and was washing his hands. Nora was sitting on the kitchen floor with a wooden spoon she had apparently been using as a drumstick. When Silas came through the door, Nora said, You were gone a long time. We were, he said. I helped Elsie with the pot. Did you? I stirred. Elsie said I had to stir the same direction every time or it goes wrong. A pause. I don't know if that's true. It's true for some things, he said. Nora considered this with the seriousness she brought to most topics. Which things? Gravy, he said. Not soup. Nora nodded as though this was the most important information she'd received all week, and possibly it was. Mara watched Silas hang up his coat and hat and move to the basin to wash, and she watched Nora track him with her eyes, the way a cat tracks a person it has decided belongs to it, and she thought about the word careful, about the difference between cold and careful, about the kind of person who learned to be careful because being open had cost them something, and what it meant that a 4-year-old had walked right through all of that without even trying. Supper was loud in the way supper had started to become Tommy narrating his day, Elsie correcting minor factual errors in Tommy's account, Nora contributing remarks that were only tangentially related to whatever was being discussed, Caleb eating and occasionally saying something short and surprisingly dry that made Mara blink and then almost laugh. Silas sat at his end of the table and said less than anyone, but he was listening. She could tell by the way his eyes moved. After supper, when she was cleaning up and the children had gone to the back room, she heard Caleb's voice from the hallway. Mr. Blackwood, she went still. Yes, Silas said. A pause. Tomorrow, if you need help on the north fence, the section we didn't finish last week, I can do it. Silence, all right, Silas said. First light, another pause. She could almost feel Caleb working out whether to say something else. The mare's leg looks okay, Caleb said finally. I checked her this afternoon. Good, Silas said. Keep an eye on it another few days. I will. Footsteps. The back room door. Mara stood at the basin for a long moment with her hands in the water. It was not a dramatic thing. No one had wept. No speeches were made. A 12-year-old boy had offered to help with the fence, and a taciturn rancher had said first light, and that was all. But she had stood in enough doorways and listened through enough walls in the past 2 years to know what things cost and what they meant, and that small, plain exchange had cost Caleb something significant, and Silas had received it without making it into more than it was, which was exactly the right thing to do. She drained the basin and dried her hands and went to check on Nora. Outside, the wind was picking up again, pressing against the walls with the particular persistence of a Montana November, and somewhere on the north pasture, the cattle were moving together the way they did when the cold was going to get serious. Mara lay down in the narrow bed beside her youngest daughter and looked at the ceiling of the room that was starting, in spite of everything she had told herself, to feel less like a borrowed space. She was not ready to call it home. She wasn't sure she had the right to. But the word was there, at the edge of things, and she found, for the first time in longer than she could accurately count, that she didn't immediately push it away. She let it sit. She closed her eyes. Caleb in the next bed was already asleep, actually asleep, not the careful stillness of a child on guard, and his breathing was slow, and outside the window, the Montana sky was dark and enormous, and full of weather, and inside Blackwood Ranch, 6 people were all, for this one moment at rest. It would not last. She knew it would not last. The winter was going to get worse before it got better, and there were things she and Silas had not said to each other, and things between her and Caleb that were still unresolved, and things about this arrangement that remained unspoken and possibly unspeakable. Right now, in this moment, her children were warm and fed, and finally sleeping without fear. She held that and let everything else wait. The snow came on a Wednesday night without much warning. There had been signs, the kind Silas could read, and Mara was learning to the way the cattle had pressed against the south wall of the barn since Monday. The quality of the silence that settled over the ridge. In the afternoon, the particular color the sky went in the hour before dark, not gray, but something older and more committed than gray. Silas had spent Tuesday moving additional hay into the barn and checking the water troughs and doing a dozen small things that Mara now understood were not habits but calculations. He was solving for a problem before it arrived. By midnight Wednesday, the problem arrived. Mara woke to the sound of wind at a register she hadn't heard before, not the usual press and moan of a Montana night, but something with force behind it, directional and relentless, kind of wind that had somewhere to be and was not interested in what stood in its way. She lay still for a moment, listening. Beside her, Nora slept undisturbed, which meant the sound wasn't yet alarming enough to wake a 4-year-old, which she took as a small mercy. She got up. The kitchen window showed her nothing but dark and movement snow driving sideways, the barn light a blurred orange smear at the edge of visibility. The temperature inside the house had dropped since she'd banked the stove before bed. She built it up, added 2 logs, stood by it while the room came back to itself. Silas was already awake. She heard his boots in the hallway before she saw him, and he came through the kitchen door dressed to go outside. His expression the same focused non-expression he wore when he was working through something serious. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough," he said. He pulled on his second glove, her gloves on the table. She noticed ready for her without either of them having discussed it. "I need to check the cattle. Some of the younger ones will panic in this. I'll come. Stay with the children. They're asleep. This won't wake them for another hour, at least." She was already reaching for her coat. "You said yourself it takes 2 people to move a panicking animal in a tight space." He looked at her for a moment. "Stay in my tracks," he said. "Don't get more than 3 feet from me." The cold outside was a different category of cold than anything she had experienced at the ranch so far. It was not just low temperature, it had weight and intention, and the wind drove the snow into her face in a way that made it difficult to keep her eyes open. She could see approximately 6 feet in any direction. Silas moved ahead of her in a straight line toward the barn, and she followed his footprints exactly as he told her to. And it took longer than it should have to cover 40 feet of ground. Inside the barn, the noise of the storm became muffled, and the warmth of the animals was immediate and physical. 3 of the younger steers had bunched in the far corner and were showing whites of eyes and rolling heads in the way that meant they were close to doing something destructive. Silas went to them without hesitation, moving into the space between them with a calmness that was either genuine or very well practiced, talking low and constant while he repositioned them away from the corner, where, if they pressed together hard enough, they could break a rail and hurt each other. Mara worked the other side. She had learned enough in the past weeks to know not to approach from directly behind, to keep her movements slow and her presence felt rather than sudden. She positioned herself at an angle that gave the nearest steer a direction to move that wasn't into the wall, and it took it, lumbering away with the particular resignation of a large animal that has decided the current threat is less immediate than the next thing. They worked for nearly an hour. When they came back inside, stamping snow from their boots in the kitchen, she couldn't feel her feet properly, and her fingers took several minutes at the stove before they stopped hurting. Neither of them said anything for a while. Then Silas poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the table in front of her, and she wrapped her hands around it, and they sat in the kitchen, with the storm pressing against the walls on all sides and the stove ticking as the metal expanded with heat. And that was enough. "This'll run 2 days," he said. "Maybe 3. The supplies will hold. I stretched the calculation after you talked to me about the wood." She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee. "You recalculated for 6 people," she said. "I recalculated for the actual situation," he said, "which is 6 people." She didn't say anything. He seemed to mean it practically, not tenderly, and she accepted it on those terms. But she sat with it afterward, in the part of herself that kept track of things that mattered. The storm lasted 2.5 days. For 2.5 days, the world beyond the windows did not exist. It was only the house, the stove, the 6 of them, in close quarters, navigating the particular friction of confinement. Tommy, who had essentially unlimited energy under normal circumstances, became by the second day something approaching a natural disaster indoors. He reorganized the items on the kitchen shelf twice for reasons he could not adequately explain. He attempted to teach Nora a game whose rules he invented as he went, which caused Nora to sit in concentrated fury when she lost at rules she hadn't been told. He asked Silas 17 questions about cattle in a single afternoon, and Silas answered 17 with a patience that Mara found both impressive and somewhat bewildering. Elsie read. Elsie read the almanac for the second time, the short stories for the third, and then asked Silas if there were any more books elsewhere in the house. He was quiet for a moment, then went to the hallway and came back with 2 more: A History of the Montana Territory and something that appeared to be a manual for field medicine, which was not standard children's reading, but which Elsie accepted with the same gratitude she would have given a novel. "Where did these come from?" Elsie asked. "Back shelf," he said. "Didn't think you'd want those." "I want all of them," Elsie said, with a sincerity so complete it was almost startling. He looked at her for a second. "All right," he said. Caleb spent the storm mostly helping restacking the wood supply inside, maintaining the stove when Mara was occupied with other things, checking on the barn animals in the brief windows when the wind dropped slightly and movement was possible. He did this without being asked, which was new, and he and Silas developed during those 2.5 days a working shorthand that Mara watched accrue like compound interest, small, practical, unspoken, adding up to something she didn't have a name for yet. The third afternoon, while the storm was beginning its slow retreat, and the wind had dropped from catastrophic to merely brutal, Silas sat down at the table with a piece of leather and his tools and started working on something. Mara was sewing nearby. The children were in the back. It was the quietest the house had been in 2 days. "You had children before?" she asked. She hadn't planned to ask it. It came out while her hands were busy, the way things sometimes did. He didn't answer immediately. She thought he might not answer at all. "No," he said, "but you expected to." Another silence, longer. She kept her eyes on her work. "I was married," he said, "long time ago. Before the ranch, she waited." She didn't. He stopped, tried a different angle. "We were in Ohio. I wanted to come west." She didn't. A pause. "That's the short version. And the long version takes more than one evening." She accepted that. "Do you regret it? Coming west?" He turned the leather over in his hands. "I regret things about how it happened, not the direction." She thought about Daniel, about the ways a marriage could be good and still not protect you from loss, about the ways people make choices that make sense at the time and leave things behind that don't stop mattering. "I regret some things too," she said mostly. "Things I didn't say soon enough." He looked at her then. Direct, which he didn't always do. "Your husband?" "There was a period near the end, before he got sick, when I knew something was wrong but I didn't push. He was worried about something, and I could see it, and I told myself he'd tell me when he was ready." She paused. He ran out of time to be ready. Silas was quiet. "I don't know that knowing would have changed anything," she said. "The debt was already what it was. But I would have had the chance to help him carry it, and I didn't get that." "That's not your fault," he said. "No," she said, "but I still have to live with it." He nodded slowly, like he understood this not as a thing to be solved, but as a thing that exists. She appreciated that. She was very tired of people telling her things were not her fault, as though that settled something. When the storm ended, it ended fast, the way violent things sometimes do, dropping the wind overnight, and leaving a stillness that felt almost suspicious after days of noise. The morning after was blinding, the snow reflecting a flat winter light in every direction, the world reconfigured by white into something that was beautiful in the objective, impersonal way of things that don't care about you. There was damage. A section of the east fence had come down under the weight of accumulated snow. One of the outbuilding roofs had developed a leak that had gone from drip to consistent stream. 3 fence posts on the south pasture had pulled free of the frozen ground. Silas assessed all of this with the methodical grimness of a man adding problems to a list that was already long. Mara walked the perimeter with him, noting what she saw, and they worked through the afternoon on the most urgent repairs. Caleb helped with the fence posts, stomping at the frozen ground to break it loose before they could reseat the posts. Developing a rhythm with Silas that was neither friendly nor unfriendly, but was functional in the particular way of two people who have decided, without discussing it, to get the job done. It was in this period, in the days after the first serious storm, in the accumulated ordinary work of maintaining a ranch through a hard winter, that something began shifting in the house that Mara could feel, but not quite see directly. It was not dramatic. It was not a single moment. It was more like the way a room changes temperature, incrementally, until you realize at some point that you are no longer cold. The children called Silas by his first name, now all of them except Caleb, who still said Mr. Blackwood with a consistency that was no longer hostile, but had become, Mara thought, a kind of respect the name as a marker of the distance between a boy and a man he was beginning to look up to, without being ready to admit it. Nora had, sometime in the second week of December, simply annexed a corner of whatever room Silas was in as her own. She brought things to occupy herself: her carved wooden horse, a piece of yarn she was attempting to braid with mixed results, a collection of interesting-shaped rocks she had gathered from Tommy, who had agreed to share his collection with the seriousness of a legal transaction, and she arranged these items on the floor and conducted her activities while Silas worked or read or maintained equipment nearby. He had stopped commenting on this. He had started, Mara noticed, working around her arrangements without disturbing them. Elsie had, with characteristic indirectness, begun asking Silas questions about the ranch. Not the practical questions Tommy asked, but the historical ones. How long had it been here? Who had built it? What was this territory like before the cattle ranches? Silas didn't have answers to everything, but what he knew he told her directly, and Elsie's listened in the particular focused way. She listened to everything and stored it somewhere and produced it later in a conversation when it was relevant. And Mara had watched Silas's expression. The first time this happened, the first time Elsie's referenced something he'd told her 2 weeks before, and it was not a dramatic expression, but it was there, a kind of quiet surprise at being remembered. And Caleb. Caleb was working every morning. Not because he was asked. Silas had stopped asking after the first week and started simply noting what needed doing and leaving it. And Caleb had started appearing at those tasks with the same reliability. He was learning things. Mara could see the learning happening in the way he moved around the barn now, in the way he handled tools, in the way he looked at problems on the ranch and took a moment to think about them before asking what to do, and sometimes didn't ask at all. She should have felt only proud. She did feel proud. But underneath it was something more complicated, a grief that surprised her, the grief of watching her son learn to be capable in a world she had not wanted him to need this kind of capability in. He was 12. He should have been learning these things at 15 or 16, with Daniel teaching him, slowly, with a father's patience and a father's jokes about doing it wrong the first time. Instead, he was learning them now, in a hard winter, from a man who was not his father. The learning was real, and the man was good, and the circumstances were what they were. She held all of that at once, and let it be complicated, because it was, and she had stopped spending energy trying to make things simpler than they were. It was in the third week of December that she first noticed something was wrong with Caleb in a way that was different from the usual wrong. He had always been contained, pulled inward, watchful, carrying more than he should. She knew that. But this was something beneath that, something that was not just his usual guardedness, but a new weight, a specific preoccupation she couldn't identify. He ate less at supper for 3 nights running, which with a growing 12-year-old was a signal she didn't ignore. He answered questions directly, but offered nothing extra. He went to sleep earlier than usual, which with Caleb generally meant he was thinking too hard about something he didn't want to think about in front of anyone. She tried twice to open a conversation, and he deflected both times with a politeness that was worse than his usual deflection, because it was clearly practiced. She told herself to give it a few more days. On a Sunday evening, she came across him in the barn, ostensibly checking on the gray mare's leg, which had healed completely 2 weeks ago. He was standing with his hand on the mare's neck, not really, looking at her, his face doing something private and complicated that smoothed out the moment he heard Mara behind him. "Her leg's fine," he said. "I know," Mara said. "I wasn't checking on the horse." He looked at the horse. "Talk to me," she said. "I'm fine. Caleb." He moved his hand on the mare's neck. A long silence settled in the barn, broken by the animals shifting and the wind starting up outside. "We eat a lot," he said finally. She waited. "4 of us." He still didn't look at her. "Plus you. That's 5 extra people eating his food. 5 people using his wood. 5 people taking up space in his house that was fine before we got here." He offered. I know he offered. He turned to look at her then, and his eyes were the serious adult eyes he'd been wearing since October a year ago. But he offered because he didn't know. He thought, I don't know what he thought, but we're still here, and it's December, and the winter's not half over, and there are 5 of us and 1 of him. And I've done the math, Mom. Kept her voice even. And what does your math say? That we cost more than we contribute. His jaw was tight. I try to help. I know I'm not a man. I can't do what he can do. But I try, and it still doesn't even out. Caleb, he's going to realize it, he said, if he hasn't already. He's going to look at the supplies, and he's going to think about the spring, and he's going to realize that feeding 4 children through a Montana winter was a mistake, and he was just too... He stopped. He's too proud to say it. She stood very still. "You believe that?" "I think it's likely," he said, with the careful precision he used when he was most frightened. She looked at her son, this 12-year-old, who had spent 14 months being the thing between his family and disaster, who had learned to do math that children should not have to do, and felt a complexity of love and heartbreak, and something close to anger that had no clean target. "Come inside," she said. "Please." He came. She put him at the kitchen table and she sat across from him, and she told him, as plainly as she could, that he was wrong. Not about the math. She didn't insult him by arguing with the math. She told him he was wrong about what the math meant. She told him that Silas Blackwood had opened a gate in November knowing exactly what he was opening it for, and he was not a man who made decisions without understanding them. Caleb listened. He didn't argue, but she could see in his face that he had heard the words and filed them separately from the fear, and the fear was still there. She went to bed that night, with his words sitting in her chest. He's going to realize it. She lay awake long enough that the stove had gone down significantly before she finally slept. She should have seen it coming. Later, she would go back over the 2 days before and find the signs she had missed, the way Caleb had eaten a full supper both evenings without complaint, which she had taken as improvement and which now read differently. The way he had spent an extra hour in the barn on the last afternoon, which she had assumed was the mare. The way he had said goodnight to his sisters with a completeness she had not examined at the time. She should have seen it. She hadn't. She woke at 5 in the morning to a sound she couldn't name, not a loud sound, just wrongness, an absence where presence should be. She lay still for 3 seconds identifying it. Then she got up. Caleb's bed was empty. Not warm empty, where someone just left. Cold empty. He had been gone long enough for the blankets to lose his heat. She found the note on the kitchen table, written in his careful, deliberate handwriting, the handwriting of a boy who had learned to write from his father and still held the pen the same way. "I'm not making things harder. Take care of Nora and the others. I'll be fine." She stood at the table and read it twice and felt something drop through her that had no bottom. Outside the windows, it was still dark, and it was snowing. She went to Silas's door and knocked once, hard. He opened it in 15 seconds, already half-dressed, reading her face before she said a word. She held out the note. He read it. His expression did not change dramatically. It was the same thing it always did, consolidating rather than opening, but something behind his eyes went very intent. "How long?" he asked. "The bed's cold. At least 2 hours. Maybe 3. He was already moving to the door. "Wake Elsie. Have her stay with the young ones. Don't let them outside." "I'm coming with you." "You can't." He was pulling on his coat, his movements quick and without wasted motion. If I lose his tracks, I need to backtrack and try again. 2 people in this means 2 sets of footprints, and I can't afford to misread them. He looked at her. I need you here, in case he doubles back. She understood the logic. She hated the logic. He won't double back, she said. He thinks he's doing the right thing. Silas met her eyes for a moment. I know, he said. That's why I'm going now. He went out into the dark and the snow. Mara stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the lantern light go smaller and smaller until the snow swallowed it entirely, and then she was alone in a kitchen with 4 hours, until full daylight and a child missing in a Montana blizzard, and she went to wake Elsie. Elsie did not cry. She went white and still, and then she put her hand over her mouth for one moment. Then she said, "Okay, what do you need me to do?" And that was Elsie. That was exactly Elsie. And Mara held her for 3 seconds, fiercely, and then told her. The next hours were the longest of Mara's life, and she had had some long ones. She kept the stove going. She fed Tommy and Nora breakfast when they woke, telling them that Caleb had gone out early to help with the animals, and that Silas had gone to get him for breakfast, because it was the closest version of a lie that she could manage. Tommy believed her. Nora looked at her for a long moment, with the ancient, measuring look she sometimes produced, and then let it go. Elsie sat at the table with the almanac open in front of her and did not read it. By 7, the light was coming up gray and thin, and the snow had slowed somewhat but not stopped. And Mara stood at the kitchen window and watched the white distance, where the trail to the north pasture disappeared, and felt something she had not let herself feel, since Daniel a terror so complete. It had no edges. A fear that lived in the body rather than the mind and could not be reasoned with. She prayed in the way people pray when they don't have a specific party to address a formless, directed wanting, aimed at the cold air and the snow and whatever was out there, deciding things. At 9:15, she saw the lantern. She was at the door, before she'd made a conscious decision to move, and then she was on the porch, in the cold in her indoor boots, watching the light resolve into Silas on horseback, and across the saddle in front of him, something wrapped in his coat, something that was moving. She made a sound she didn't know she was capable of making. By the time Silas reached the porch, she could see Caleb's face pale and slack with cold. His lips wrong-colored, his eyes open but not entirely focused. Silas had wrapped his own coat around the boy and held him against his chest for the ride back, and Caleb was shivering in the deep, violent way that meant his body was still working. Still working. Silas handed him down to her carefully, and she took his weight, all of it, more than she expected. He had grown so much this year, and carried him inside. "Stove," Silas said behind her. "Close to it. Don't put him in the bed yet. He needs to warm by degrees." She got Caleb onto the floor by the stove, wrapped in blankets. His hands were very cold, and she held them between hers, and she did not cry. Not then. She did not have the spare capacity for crying. Every part of her was occupied with watching him breathe and feeling his hands for warmth, and listening to Silas behind her, issuing the kinds of instructions that told her he had done this before, or known someone who had. "Warm water," Silas said. "Not hot warm. Let him sip it when he can." She warmed the water. She let Caleb sip it. The color came back into his face over the next 30 minutes, in a way that was not quick or cinematic, but slow and stuttering. 2 steps forward, a long pause, forward again. Tommy and Nora and Elsie sat against the far wall of the kitchen, in a row, not moving, watching their brother. When Caleb's eyes finally focused properly, when he looked at his mother and his expression registered where he was, and what had happened, the first thing he did was look at Silas. Silas was sitting at the table, still in his shirt sleeves, because he'd given his coat to the boy on the horse and hadn't yet retrieved it from the porch. He was holding a cup of coffee with both hands and looking at Caleb with an expression that Mara did not have a category for and suspected Silas hadn't had occasion to use in a long time. Caleb opened his mouth. His voice was rough and thin. "I thought," he started. "I know what you thought," Silas said. Caleb swallowed. His throat worked. "I was trying to—" "I know that too." Silence. The stove ticked. Nora, against the far wall, was crying in a small and silent way. tears running down her face while she held absolutely still. Silas set down his coffee. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and he looked at Caleb on the floor by his stove, 12 years old and shivering in 4 blankets. He said, with a quietness that had iron in it, "You are not a burden. None of you are. You hear me?" Caleb's jaw moved. His eyes were wet. "You doing math in your head about what you cost?" Silas stopped. Started again. "That's not your job. You understand? That has never been your job." Caleb pressed his mouth together. He was fighting hard and visibly. "I thought you'd be better off," he managed. "Without 5 of us eating your..." "You thought wrong." Silas's voice did not rise. It stayed flat and even and completely certain. "You were wrong about that." A pause. Caleb's breath came in a shudder. "What I have here," Silas said carefully, like he was choosing each word from a limited supply, "is enough for 6 people. It has been enough for 6 people since November. If it weren't, I would have said so." Caleb looked at him. The look was the look of a child who wants very badly to believe something and has stopped letting himself believe things too quickly. "Why didn't you say something?" Caleb asked. "To me. If it was fine, why didn't you?" "Because I thought you knew," Silas said, and something in his voice shifted slightly. Not quite guilt, but in the neighborhood of it. "That's on me. I should have been clearer." The kitchen was very quiet. Then Caleb, for the first time since his father's funeral, put his face in his hands and cried. It was not a graceful thing. It was ugly and loud and surprised sounding, like something that had been held too long under pressure, finally finding the exit. Mara put her arms around him, and he let her, which itself was something. He had not let her hold him like this in a year, had gone stiff, and endured it when she tried, protecting both of them from the size of what he was feeling. He didn't go stiff now. He leaned into her, and he cried, and she held him. And across the kitchen, Silas stood up quietly and took his coffee to the window and looked out at the snow with his back to the room, giving the boy what privacy he could without leaving. After a while, the crying wound down, and Caleb sat up and scrubbed his face with the heel of his hand and looked at the floor. Nora detached herself from the far wall and crossed the kitchen and sat down next to her brother and leaned against his arm without saying anything. He looked at her. His face was blotchy and exhausted. "You were gone," she said simply. "I'm here now," he said. "I know." She leaned harder against him. "Don't do that again." He swallowed. "Okay," he said. It was not a perfect moment. He was still cold, and she was still 4 years old, and Mara's hands were still shaking slightly, and the storm was still technically in progress outside. None of it was resolved. The fears that had driven Caleb into a blizzard at 3 in the morning had not been solved by Silas's words, however true those words were. Boys don't unlearn a year of adult fear in one morning. That would take time, real time, the unglamorous kind. But he was home, he was here, he was breathing. And Silas Blackwood, standing at the window of his own kitchen, with his coffee going cold, had ridden into a blizzard at 5 in the morning for a boy who wasn't his, and had brought him back, and had sat on the floor level and spoken to him plainly, without drama or lecture, in the exact register a frightened child needed to hear. Mara looked at the back of Silas's head. She had told herself, from the beginning, not to trust things that seemed too good. She had told herself that kindness, without a price tag, was the oldest trick there was. She had told herself 100 things in the past 6 weeks, designed to keep her standing at a careful distance from this man and this place. She was running out of reasons to believe any of them. Outside, the snow was finally, genuinely stopping. The clouds were breaking at the western edge, and light, real light, winter, then but present, was coming through in the first clean break they'd seen in days. Caleb, sitting on the kitchen floor, wrapped in blankets, with his sister against his arm, looked at that light in the window for a long moment. Then he looked at Silas's back. "Mr. Blackwood," he said. Silas turned. Caleb looked at him steadily, with his red-rimmed eyes and his exhausted face, and said, "Thank you." Silas looked at him for a moment. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just don't do it again." Caleb almost smiled. The edge of it was there, brief and real, before it went. "Okay," he said. The light kept coming through the window, spreading across the kitchen floor in a long, pale stripe, and the stove ticked, and somewhere out in the barn, the gray mare shifted in her stall, and the day continued on into itself, with all of its complications and all of its unresolved things, which was the only way days ever actually continued. The day after Caleb came home from the blizzard, nobody talked about it directly. That was, Mara had come to understand how this household processed hard things, not with discussion or declaration, but with continuation, with the next meal and the next task, and the next ordinary requirement of staying alive on a working ranch in December. The children went back to their routines. Silas went back to his. The storm had passed and left damage that needed addressing, and addressing it was the thing that got done. But something had shifted. She could feel it, the way you feel a change in air pressure, not dramatically, not in any single identifiable moment, but in the accumulation of small things that were different from how they had been before. Caleb was different. Not healed, she was careful not to use that word, even in her own thinking, because it implied a completeness that wasn't honest. But he moved through the ranch with less of the coiled, defensive watchfulness that had characterized every week since November. Still watched. He still assessed. But the watching had changed its purpose. It was no longer the watching of a boy braced for the thing that would end this, cataloging exits. It was the watching of someone learning a place, taking it in, storing it, beginning, almost against his will, to belong to it. He started calling Silas by his first name 3 days after the blizzard, not as a statement, not with any ceremony, just naturally, the way it slipped out when he was asking about the water trough that had developed a crack on the east side of the barn. And he said, Silas, the trough, and Silas said, I know, I'm getting to it. And that was all. Mara heard it from the kitchen doorway and did not say anything. And when she turned back to the stove, her eyes were stinging in a way she attributed to the smoke. Silas did not comment on the name either. He just answered to it as though it had always been the case, and went on telling Caleb what he'd already assessed about the crack and what materials they'd need to fix it properly, versus the temporary patch they'd do today, while the permanent fix waited on a supply run to Garrison. This was the texture of the days now. Close, occasionally uncomfortable, in the way of people still learning each other's edges, but moving forward together in a direction that had not fully revealed itself yet, but that felt less provisional than it had in November. The week after the blizzard, Silas made the supply run to Garrison alone, and when he came back he had 3 things in the wagon that nobody had asked for. A pair of proper winter boots for Tommy, whose current ones had developed a split along the left sole, a spool of bright blue thread that matched almost exactly the color of a dress Mara had mentioned, offhand, 2 weeks ago needed mending at the collar, and a small wooden box latched which he set on Elsie's side of the kitchen shelf, without explanation. Elsie looked at the box. She looked at Silas. She opened it. Inside were 6 more books. She stood at the shelf for a long moment, without moving her hand on the open box. These are for me, she said. Therefore whoever reads them, he said, which will be you and possibly Nora in a few years. Elsie turned around. Her face was doing something complicated and young, a child's unguarded gratitude, and she said, "Thank you, Silas," with a formality that was entirely sincere, and he said, "You're welcome," in the clipped way he had of receiving things he didn't know what to do with. Later, Mara was in the hallway when she heard Tommy say, loudly, "What about me? Did you get me anything?" And Silas said, "Check your boots." A pause. Then Tommy, with the vocal range he deployed for maximum enthusiasm. "These fit? They're supposed to fit. That's the point of boots. My old ones had a hole in them. I know. I stepped on them once." Tommy was quiet for approximately 4 seconds, which was unusual. Then, "Did you know my size?" A pause. "I looked at your old ones," Silas said. Tommy apparently had no response to this. Mara, in the hallway, leaned her shoulder against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment. She didn't tell herself anything about what this meant. She just let it be what it was. January arrived with a cold that was more serious than anything the first 2 months had prepared her for. The temperature dropped to places that made the previous cold seem like a misunderstanding. The kind of cold where the air itself felt hostile, where you checked exposed skin for whitening within minutes of going outside, where the horse's nostrils crusted and the water in the trough had to be broken with a hammer twice a day. Silas was outside for longer hours than she liked, and she tried not to notice. Noticed anyway the specific ways he managed it, the double-layered wool, the grease he worked into the leather of his gloves, pattern of going out and coming in and warming up and going out again that kept anyone from staying too long in the cold. She started having coffee ready when she knew he was coming in, not because he asked, because it was a practical thing to do, and because in this household practical things were the language everyone was most comfortable speaking. He noticed. He didn't say anything directly for the first week. Then one morning he came in from checking the cattle, and there was the coffee on the table, and he stood by the stove for a moment warming his hands, and he said, without turning around, "You don't have to do that." "I know," she said. A pause. "Okay," he said, and picked up the cup. She went back to the bread she was kneading, and neither of them said anything else about it. Coffee kept appearing, and he kept drinking it, and they both understood, in the way things get understood in quiet households, that they had agreed to something without naming it. The children's lessons had become a regular morning feature by January. Mara had been a schoolteacher for 2 years, before she married Daniel, and while she had not thought of that as relevant to the current situation, she had found herself slipping back into the habits of it, the structure of a morning lesson, the way you scaffold information, the difference between telling a child something and giving them the tools to find it themselves. She taught them at the kitchen table, reading, arithmetic, some history, geography from Elsie's almanac. Silas never participated, but he was often somewhere nearby, and she had twice caught him listening from the hallway to something she explaining to Tommy about how rivers cut through rock. The second time, she waited until the children were occupied with their work and went to the hallway. He was standing with his shoulder against the wall, arms crossed, not embarrassed to be found there. "You can sit in," she said, "if you want." "I'm not much of a student," he said. "You were listening." "I like the way you explain things," he said, and then seemed to realize this was a more personal statement than he had intended, and looked at the wall. Kept her face neutral. The kitchen table has room. He didn't join the lessons, but after that, he stopped moving away when she was teaching, and sometimes, in the evenings, she would find him reading one of Elsie's books, the Montana History, usually in the same chair he sat in for everything else, and she stopped pretending she hadn't noticed. It was the middle of January when Harlan Briggs arrived at Blackwood Ranch. She had not thought about him in weeks. That in itself was a kind of relief she hadn't registered until it ended, because the moment she saw his horse at the gate from the kitchen window, the familiar tight, cold feeling came back as though it had never left. She didn't know how he'd found her. Later, she would learn from the woman at the dry goods store in Garrison Cent that Harlan had made inquiries during his own supply run, and the woman who had not known Mara well but had not liked Harlan for years had told him only that she'd given directions to Blackwood Ranch and nothing more. It was enough. He was a man who followed directions to the end. Silas was in the barn. Harlan knocked on the kitchen door and Mara opened it, and they stood looking at each other across the threshold, and his expression had the particular quality of a man who was pleased to find exactly what he was looking for. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, "I'm glad to see you're settled." "Mr. Briggs," she said. She did not step back from the door. He looked past her into the kitchen. She saw him take in the children's coats on the hook, the school books on the table, the 2 cups by the stove. "I came to discuss the outstanding matter," he said. "There's nothing outstanding," she said. "The house was yours as of the date you specified. I left the keys on the table." "I'm not talking about the house," he smiled. It was not a warm smile. Daniel also had a secondary obligation, a note he signed in his personal capacity, separate from the property loan. A smaller amount, but the interest has been running. She went very still. I've never seen any document like that. That's because Daniel managed his affairs privately. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. The amount with interest is here. I'd appreciate resolution before spring. She looked at the paper. She did not take it. Show me the original signature, she said. Something moved through his expression, quick, controlled. The documentation is in order. I'd like to see the original, she said again. With a date and a witness signature, he held her gaze. I don't think you're in a position. I think you should show the lady the original. Silas had come up behind her, without her hearing him, which meant he had come from the side of the house rather than through the kitchen, and he was standing 2 feet back from the doorway, with his hands loose at his sides, and his expression entirely composed, which, she had learned, was when he was most serious. Harlan looked at him, something recalculated in his face. This is a private financial matter between myself and Mrs. Ellison, he said. Mrs. Ellison is here, Silas said. If it's between you and her, she's the one to settle it. I'm just interested in seeing a document with a proper witness signature since you brought it up. A beat of silence. Harlan's jaw moved. The documentation is either in order or it isn't, Silas said. If it is, showing it costs you nothing. Harlan held the folded paper another moment. Then he put it back in his coat. I'll be back with the full file, he said. His voice was even, the voice of a man who had decided to find a different angle rather than retreat. We'll be here, Silas said. Harlan left. They watched his horse go back down the north road until the distance took it. Mara turned from the door. Her hands were not shaking, which surprised her. She looked at Silas. You think the document is real? He asked. I don't know, she said. Daniel kept things from me. I know that now. She paused. But Daniel also told me once that Harlan Briggs was the kind of man who charged for every service and invented a few extra. He said it like a warning. Silas looked at the road where Harlan had gone. Does he have legal standing in this county? He's on the bank's board. He has standing everywhere he wants it. That's not the same thing as being right. No, she said. But it's sometimes enough. He was quiet for a moment. When he comes back with the document, I want to look at it before you answer him anything. She studied him. You know what to look for? I know some things, he said, which was, she had come to understand his version of yes. She nodded. Inside, Elsie was at the table with her history book, pretending not to have heard anything. Tommy was cleaning tack near the back wall. Nora was on the floor with her wooden horse. Caleb, who had been in the barn when Harlan arrived, and had apparently moved around the outside of the house to see, without being seen, appeared at the back door, a minute later, with snow on his boots and an expression that was all angles. Who was that? He asked. Someone from before, Mara said. It's being handled. He looked at her. He looked at Silas. Did he threaten you? No, she said. Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked at the road through the window for a moment. He looked like the kind of man who threatens people. He is, Mar said. We're handling it. Caleb looked at Silas. We are, Silas confirmed. Something passed across Caleb's face, not quite reassurance, but decision to let the adults nets manage the thing. Cost him something. This decision. She could see that, but he made it. Okay, he said, and went to hang up his coat. Harlan came back 4 days later, brought the document. He also brought a man named Fitch from the county seat, who had the bearing, who worked adjacent to legal proceedings without being quite a lawyer, and who seemed to be there for the implicit weight of his presence rather than any specific function. Silas looked at the document for a long time at the kitchen table. Mara sat across from him. Harlan and Fitch stood near the door. Silas turned the paper over. He looked at the witness signature. He looked at the date in relation to the notary stamp in the corner, which did not quite align with the county's recording schedule, something he recognized because he had dealt with property documentation himself when he'd expanded the ranch's north pasture 4 years ago and learned the hard way what proper paperwork looked like. He set the document on the table. The witness signature is dated 3 days before the notary stamp, he said. In this county, the notary processes same day or within 24 hours. That's their policy. I know because I've used this notary. Harlan's expression tightened. Administrative delays are not policy, Silas said. This document was backdated, a silence that had weight in it. Fitch looked at Harlan. It was the look of a man reassessing the risk of his own involvement. You can't prove that, Harlan said. No, Silas said, but a county judge can ask the notary directly. And a judge tends to get interested when a bank officer is collecting on a dead man's alleged private debt with a document that doesn't quite hold up to examination. He paused. You want to make that trip to the county seat? The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind was up, and the cold pressed at the walls, and the stove ticked. Harlan picked up the document. He folded it with the careful movements of a man controlling his hands deliberately. This isn't finished, he said. I expect you believe that, Silas said. Harlan left. Fitch left 2 steps behind him. Mara sat at the kitchen table and listened to the horses leave and did not move for a moment. Then she put her hands flat on the table and exhaled slowly. Is it finished? She asked. Silas considered. Probably. He's not going to a judge with a document that doesn't hold up. The risk is too high for a man with a bank board position. A pause. He might try something else, but not that. How did you know about the notary policy? Picked up his coffee cup. I paid attention when it mattered to me, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, she said. It was the second time she'd said that to him for something significant, and both times it had felt inadequate, and both times he had received it the same way, a brief nod, eyes moving away, as though gratitude made him less comfortable than the problem had. She thought about what it must be like to be a person who found solving things easier than receiving thanks for it. She thought she might understand, actually. She might understand quite well. February came in, and the quality of the cold began, almost imperceptibly, to change. It was still serious cold. It was still Montana February, which meant the mornings were brutal, and the wind off the ridge was not something you argued with. But there were afternoons, not many, not warm, but afternoons where the light had a different quality than January light, something less flat, something that suggested, distantly, that the world had not permanently committed to this. The children felt it before anyone else did. Children feel seasonal shifts in their bodies before adults feel them in their minds. Tommy started spending more time outside again, not for ranch purposes, but simply because he wanted to, standing in the yard looking at the sky, with the same expression he wore when he was thinking about his rocks. Nora followed Silas into the barn with more vocal running commentary than she'd had since before the blizzard, as though the slight warming had unlocked something in her. Elsie started sitting by the window for her reading, turning her face toward the thin afternoon light. Caleb started asking Silas questions about spring. Not the way he used to ask questions carefully, with the subtext of, I am assessing how much longer we are welcome here. Just questions. About what happened to the ranch when the ground thawed, about when the cattle could go to the north pasture, about whether the fence line they'd repaired in December would hold through the freeze-thaw cycle or need looking at again. Silas answered all of it. He answered in the way he had started answering Caleb's questions over the past weeks, which was the way you answer a person you are including, rather than informing using we without making a production of it. Saying things like, we'll need to check the north line around March, and when we do the spring cattle count, and Caleb absorbed all of it with a steadiness that looked, to Mara's eye, like a young person allowing himself to plan ahead. She had not allowed herself to plan ahead. Not yet. She was still living in the day she was in, managing what was in front of her, and she told herself this was practicality rather than fear. She was not entirely sure she was right. The evening that changed things not suddenly, not dramatically, but changed them in the way the things that matter most actually change, started with supper, the way most evenings did. She had made a proper stew, the kind that took most of the afternoon, with the last of the stored root vegetables, and a portion of the beef Silas had put by in the cold larder. It was the best meal she'd made since arriving at the ranch, not because the ingredients were extraordinary, but because for the first time she had made it without calculating portions, without trimming just slightly, without the background arithmetic of scarcity. She had just made the stew the way it was supposed to be made, and it was enough. The table was loud. Tommy had apparently had an encounter with the old barn cat, a creature of severe independence who tolerated humans on her own terms, and the cat had, for reasons unknown, chosen today to follow Tommy into the barn and then into the yard, and Tommy had taken this as a declaration of friendship, so profound he had spent the afternoon composing a list of potential names for an animal that already had a life and had not asked to be renamed. He was presenting this list to the table with the seriousness of a legal brief. Patches, he said. She doesn't have patches, Elsie said. It's a personality name, not a description. That's not how naming works. I think it's a good name, Nora said entirely sincerely. Thank you, Nora. I also like Captain, Norris said. Tommy looked at her. Captain is excellent. Captain goes on the list. Caleb was eating with one elbow on the table, which Mara had given up correcting, and said, without looking up, the cat is not going to answer to any of these names. She's going to answer to whatever she decides she answers to. What a name is, Tommy said. You decide, she decides, Caleb said. You've met her. Silas, at his end of the table, said nothing. But the corner of his mouth had moved in a way that had become familiar, the near smile he produced meals when the children were funny, and he was not going to admit it directly. Mara watched him from her end of the table. She watched the way he sat at the head of his table, with 4 children arguing about a barn cat's name, and the small, controlled movement at the corner of his mouth, and she thought about November, about the sparse kitchen with its 4 chairs, about the man who had opened the gate and said, "Come inside," without ceremony or promise. She thought about what it meant that the 4 chairs were now 6, and that the 6 felt like the right number, and that she had stopped, somewhere in the past several weeks, feeling like a guest. After supper, when the children had gone to the back room, Caleb to read, the younger ones to their evening routines of noise and mild chaos, she stayed at the table to clear it, and Silas stayed with his coffee, which had become the routine. They sat in the kitchen's evening quiet, the stove down to a comfortable level, the wind outside doing its thing. She said, without planning to say it, Caleb asked me this morning if he could learn to ride properly in the spring. Silas looked at her. What did you tell him? I told him I'd see. She paused. What I meant was that it wasn't my decision to make. It's your decision, he said. He's your son. He'd be asking to use your horses, she said, and your time. Silas was quiet for a moment. He can learn to ride, he said. I'll start him in April when the ground's clear enough. She looked at her hands on the table. You keep making plans for April, she said. Came out quieter than she'd intended. He set down his coffee. Do you want me to stop? She thought about it honestly. The honest answer was more complicated than yes or no. She had been afraid of April, of the conversation that would come with it, of the question of what this arrangement was past winter, of having to define something she had let stay undefined, because definition meant deciding, and deciding meant risking. But sitting here, in this kitchen, with the sound of her children in the back room, and the stove going, and the cat apparently having taken up residence in the barn with Tommy's blessing, she found that she did not, actually, want him to stop. No, she said. He looked at her for a moment. There are things I haven't said, he said carefully. I know, she said. I wasn't sure how to say them. I know that, too. He picked up his coffee and looked at it and set it down again, and she had the sense of a man working up to something he'd been considering for a long time, measuring it against the same caution she'd been measuring everything against, and finding that the scale had finally tipped. This ranch needed people in it, he said. That's what I told you in November. That was true, but it wasn't all of it. She waited. I'd been here 11 years, he said, alone, and I'd told myself the alone was a choice and not a lack. He paused. I was wrong about that. She looked at him steadily. Your children, he stopped, tried again. They are not a complication, Mara. They never were. What I have here, this table, this place, it was waiting for exactly this. Exactly this noise and this mess and this wait. He looked at the table. I didn't know that until you came through the gate. She sat with that, for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved, and the house held against it, as it had been holding against things since November, since the first storm, since Caleb's blizzard, since Harlan Briggs and all the lesser things, the cracked trough, the split fence, the cold mornings, and the tight calculations, and the accumulated daily work of surviving a hard winter together. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go," she said. "You should know that. I'm not going to pretend it was anything more than desperation at the start." "I know," he said. "But it isn't that now," she said. "I need you to know that too." He looked at her. "I know that too," he said quietly. The stove ticked. Nora's voice came faintly from the back room, asking Elsie something about the wooden horse, and Elsie's voice came back, patient, explaining, and somewhere outside the barn cat was doing whatever barn cats do in February evenings, when a boy has decided they are friends. Silas reached across the table and set his hand on the table between them, not on her hand, not reaching for her, just there, present, offered, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she set her hand over his. She had forgotten, she realized. In 17 months of fear and grief and managing and surviving, she had forgotten what this felt like, not the specific feeling of this man's hand under hers, but the broader category of it, the feeling of not being alone in the room with everything that needed doing. She had forgotten, and now she remembered, and the remembering was not painless. Brought Daniel with it, brought the crack corner photograph, and the September morning, and all the years that had been real and good and were over, and she let that come without pushing it away. Because it was true and it would always be true. And the truth of Daniel did not cancel what was sitting across from her at this table. It was possible, she thought, to have both, to hold the past without being held by it. She did not move her hand. Neither did he. "I have 4 children," she said. It was not a warning. It was just the truth, offered without armor. "I know," he said. "I've been feeding them for 3 months." She almost laughed. The edge of it surprised her. "They're not easy," she said. "No," he agreed. "They're not. Tommy alone is a full-time occupation." She did laugh then, a short, real one. He watched her laugh with an expression she had not seen on his face before open, in the particular way of someone who has stopped protecting something. Then he said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. "Not tonight," he said. "I want to wait until I do it right. But I want you to know I intend to ask." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest was doing something complicated, something she hadn't felt in so long it took her a moment to identify. "All right," she said. "All right? Ask when you're ready," she said. "I'll be here." He looked at her. His hand under hers was still. "I know," he said, and that was enough. For tonight, for this kitchen, for the ending of a day in a hard February in a place that had begun, for all 6 of them, against all the calculations of fear, to feel like the truest thing they had. Outside, the night settled over Blackwood Ranch, and the stars were coming out between the clouds. And inside the house, the stove held its warmth against the cold. And at the kitchen table, 2 adults sat with their hands together and did not say anything else, because nothing else needed to be said. Not yet, he asked her on a Thursday in March. Not because Thursday had any particular significance, and not because March was romantic. March in Montana was mud and broken ice, and the particular exhaustion that comes from a long winter finally releasing its grip on everything all at once. The cattle were restless. The south pasture was a problem of standing water. The barn roof had developed a new complaint that was going to require a full day's attention before the spring rains made it worse. He asked her in the middle of all of that, which was, Mara would think later, exactly right. She had been at the kitchen table, going through the household accounts, a ledger she'd started keeping in January, organized with the same methodical attention she brought to everything practical, tracking what came in and what went out, and where the margins were. She had discovered in the process that the ranch's finances were sound but inefficiently managed, with several line items that could be improved through better timing of purchases, and she had mentioned this to Silas once, without elaborating, and he had looked at the ledger and said, "You're right, and handed it back to her, which she had understood as a delegation of authority she had not been given but was now accepting. She was deep in the April projections when he came in from outside and stopped at the kitchen door and stood there long enough that she looked up. He had his hat in his hands. She had almost never seen him hold his hat rather than wear it or hang it. She put down her pencil. He said, I told you I'd ask when I was ready. She said, I remember. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He set his hat on the table and he looked at her directly, which he did not always do when he was saying something important. She had noticed he tended to look slightly away when he was most serious, as though direct eye contact cost him something he was not sure he had enough of. Today he looked at her. I want you to stay, he said, not because of the winter, not because of the work, because I would like to be married to you if you're willing. No speech, no preamble, no catalog of reasons or conditions or carefully arranged sentiments. Just that. She had known it was coming. He had told her in February that he intended to ask. She had had weeks to prepare an answer, and she had spent none of that time doing so, had let the question sit unanswered in the back of her days, while she made bread and taught arithmetic and watched her children grow back into themselves. And she understood now, sitting across from this man who was holding his own hat with the careful deliberateness of someone trying to hold still, that she had not prepared an answer because she had already known it. She had known it since February, possibly before. Yes, she said. He looked at her. That was fast, he said. I had time to think about it. And yes, she said again. Something moved through his face, not joy exactly, not the extravagant happiness of a younger man, but something's older and more solid. The expression of a person receiving something they had genuinely not been certain they would receive. Relief and certainty arriving at the same time. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. And then, because they were both people who felt most comfortable when a significant moment had something practical attached to it, she picked up her pencil and he picked up his hat, and she said, April feed order needs to go in by the 20th. And he said, I know. I'll take it to Garrison on Friday. And that was how the morning continued. But she was smiling at the ledger when he went back outside, and she didn't try to stop it. Telling the children was not the simple thing she had hoped it would be, because nothing with 4 children was ever the simple thing you hoped it would be. She told them that evening, after supper, when Silas was still at the table, and the dishes were pushed aside, and the stove was doing its comfortable evening work. She told them plainly that she and Silas were going to be married, that they were going to stay at Blackwood Ranch, that this was their home now. Tommy said yes, with a volume and a fist motion that startled the barn cat, who had apparently established an indoor presence at some point in the past 2 weeks, without anyone formally authorizing it. Nora looked at Silas. Then she got up from her chair and walked around the table and climbed into his lap, which she had never done before, and sat there like it had always been the arrangement. He went very still for a moment. Then he put his arm around her, carefully, the way a man handles something he doesn't want to break. Elsie said, Does this mean we won't have to leave in the spring? It means you won't have to leave at all, Marissa said. Elsie pressed her lips together and looked at the table and nodded once. Her eyes were bright. She did not cry, because Elsie almost never cried, but she nodded with a completeness that said everything. Caleb didn't say anything for a long moment. He was looking at Silas, not at Mara. The look was not hostile and not warm. It was the look of a person doing a final serious assessment of something he had been assessing for months. Then he said, Are you going to be good to her? The kitchen went quiet. Silas looked at Caleb. He did not rush his answer. I intend to be, he said. I can't promise I'll always manage it, but that's the intention. Caleb held his gaze for another moment. Okay, he said. He didn't say anything else, but he looked at his mother with an expression that was for the first time in a year and a half not watchful, not braced, just a 12-year-old boy looking at his mother at the supper table in a house where he lived. She had to look away. The wedding was in April, the 3rd week of it, on a Saturday when the mud had dried enough to be presentable and the sky was doing something clear and blue that Montana occasionally offered in spring as though to apologize for winter. It was a small thing. The woman from the dry goods store in Garrison. Her name was Ruth, and she had become, gradually, the closest thing Mara had to a friend in the county, came with her husband. A neighboring rancher named Ed Marsh and his wife Clara, who had known Silas for years and had opinions about everything, came and brought a cake that Clara had made, and that was genuinely excellent. And Mara told her so, and Clara said, "I know," with a satisfaction that made Ruth roll her eyes. A traveling justice of the peace performed the ceremony in the front room of the ranch house, which had been cleaned to within an inch of its life by Elsie and Mara on Friday, and decorated without either of them having planned to by Nora, who had gathered every interesting rock from Tommy's collection and arranged them in a line along the windowsill. Tommy had strong feelings about this use of his collection and expressed them loudly until Nora explained that they were decorations and would be returned. And then he looked at the rocks in the window and said, "Sate seems actually that does look good," and the matter was settled. Caleb stood at Mara's side during the ceremony, not because he had been asked, because he had decided to, and no one argued. When the justice of the peace said the words, and Silas said yes, and Mara said yes, Nora, who was sitting in a chair with her wooden horse and had been told very specifically to stay in that chair and be quiet, said loudly, "Is it over?" Clara laughed first. Then Ruth, then everyone. Silas looked at Nora. "Almost," he said. "Good," Nora said. "I'm hungry." "You're always hungry," Tommy said. "That's different." How the justice of the peace, a patient man, finished the last sentence quickly. It was not a ceremony from a story. It was loud and small, and someone's child complained about being hungry in the middle of it, and the rings they exchanged were plain and not expensive. And afterward, Clara's cake was consumed with an enthusiasm that bordered on competitive, and Ed Marsh told a story about Silas from 8 years ago that Silas clearly would have preferred remain untold. And Ruth cried a little and tried to hide it, and Caleb ate 3 slices of cake and said nothing, and sat with his shoulder touching Silas's arm for most of the afternoon without appearing to notice he was doing it. It was, Mara thought, exactly right. Spring came fully in May, the way Montana spring comes reluctantly, at first, then all at once. The land going from brown to green in what felt like a single week, the cattle moving with renewed purpose, the horses shedding their rough winter coats and becoming the glossy, difficult creatures they were the rest of the year. Silas started Caleb on riding in the first week of May, not trail riding that came later. He started him on the fundamentals, how to approach a horse, how to read what it was telling you with its ears and its weight, how to mount without startling, how to sit in a way that was part of the horse's movement rather than fighting it. Caleb was not naturally gifted. He was too tense at first, holding the reins with the grips of someone expecting to fall, which communicated itself directly to the horse and produced exactly the nervousness he was trying to prevent. Silas corrected him without drama, the same way he corrected everything plainly, specifically, without the subtext of disappointment that makes instruction feel like failure. "You're gripping," he'd say. "Lighten up." "I'll fall." "You might, but you won't fall from gripping. You'll fall from not moving with her." A pause. "Fall recovery is next week. Right now we're doing sitting." By the 3rd week, Caleb was not gripping. By the 4th, he was starting to feel the difference between being on a horse and being part of one, that particular shift in the body where the two rhythms begin to match. And Mara watched from the fence one afternoon as it happened, watched her son's shoulders drop and his back ease and the mare's pace even out, and she gripped the top rail of the fence and did not say anything, just watched. Silas was on the other side of the paddock. He saw it too. He caught her eye across the space and said nothing, and she said nothing. And between them was the thing that parents feel, that specific pride and grief and hope braided together, except they were not parents in the traditional way. We're not the same kind of parents. We're still figuring out what kind they were together, and that was all right. The figuring out was something she had stopped being afraid of. In June, a letter arrived from Harlan Briggs. She recognized his handwriting on the envelope before she opened it and felt the familiar cold compress of him entering the day. She opened it at the kitchen table alone, before Silas was in from the morning work. It was not what she expected. It was brief. 3 paragraphs. The first acknowledged the disputed document and withdrew the claim. The second in this was the part she read 3 times indicated that upon review and following an inquiry from the county records office regarding the notary sequence discrepancy, the bank's board had agreed to close the matter entirely. The third paragraph was formal boilerplate about the closure of the account and bore Harlan's signature at the bottom with a precision that suggested he had been very careful about how he signed it. He had not written a personal word in it. She had not expected him to. She sat with the letter for a moment. Silas came in and saw her at the table and looked at the envelope and then at her face. She slid the letter across to him. He read it. He read it again. County Records Office, he said. Did you contact them? He set the letter down. I may have written to ask about their notary policy, he said, in a general inquiry capacity. She looked at him. When February, he said. After he left, she stared at him. You wrote to the county records office in February. I wanted to understand the process, he said, with the expression of a man who had done a practical thing and was not sure why this required elaboration. You knew he would come back. I thought it was possible. And you prepared. It seemed like the reasonable thing, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her with the flat patience of someone who genuinely did not understand why this was remarkable. She thought about the man she had met in November, standing outside his barn in the thin late afternoon light, taking in 4 children and a desperate woman with an expression she hadn't been able to read. She thought about the gloves on the table and the coffee in the mornings and the books for Elsie and the boots for Tommy and the fence line he'd ridden in a blizzard and the document he'd scrutinized with the trained attention of someone who had paid attention because it mattered. She thought, this is who he is. This is the whole of it. A man who does the next right thing without announcement and without expectation, and who genuinely cannot see why this is worth remarking on. She folded the letter and put it in the household file she'd organized in January. Thank you, she said. You keep thanking me for things, he said. You keep doing things worth thanking you for. He looked at the file cabinet where she'd put the letter, then back at her. Something moved in his expression. You're welcome, he said. Both for the letter and for all of it, she understood. Both for February and November and December and every ordinary, extraordinary day in between. The summer that followed was not a simple summer. There was a drought scare in July that turned out to be less serious than feared, but cost 2 weeks of anxiety and a great deal of contingency planning. One of the older steers had to be put down in August. Tommy, who had named the steer without telling anyone, did not take it well and spent a day in genuine grief that Mara did not try to argue him out of, because grief that is real deserves to be felt, even at 7, even for a steer. Silas sat with him in the barn that evening. She didn't know what was said. She knew they were in there for over an hour, and when Tommy came in for supper, his face was still red, but he was present again, eating, participating, occasionally making a contribution to the table conversation that showed he was back inside the day. After supper, she asked Silas what he'd told him. Silas thought about it. I told him that it was right to feel bad, he said, and that feeling bad about it meant he'd done the caring right. She looked at him. That's exactly what you should have said. I wasn't sure, he said. I know, she said. You did it anyway. He nodded and went to refill his coffee, and she watched his back and thought about the distance between knowing the right thing and doing it, and how some people close that distance more reliably than others, quietly, without credit, in barns on hot August evenings with grieving 7-year-olds. Caleb turned 13 in September. They celebrated with dinner and a cake and the particular slightly chaotic joy of a household with multiple children who had strong opinions about how birthdays should be observed. Nora had made him a card with elaborate illustrations that were identifiable as horses only if you already knew that was the intention. Elsie had given him one of the books from her collection, the Montana History, which she announced he was old enough for, with a formality that somehow made Fat feel like a genuine gift rather than a hand-me-down. Tommy gave him a rock, but a specific one, a piece of quartz with a blue vein through it, that Tommy had been keeping in his most protected pocket for 2 months, which Caleb understood and accepted with a gravity appropriate to the magnitude of the offering. Silas came to the table that evening with something in his hand. He set it in front of Caleb. It was a knife, a working knife, wood-handled, the kind a ranch hand used for daily tasks. Not new, used, with a handle that had the worn-smooth quality of a tool that had been used well for a long time. Caleb looked at it. "That was my father's," Silas said. "He gave it to me at 13. I've used it since." He paused. "I don't have a son, but I'd like it to go to someone who'll use it the same way." The table was quiet. Caleb picked up the knife. He turned it over. His face was doing the thing it had done less and less since December, but still did sometimes the controlled interior thing where he was feeling more than he was showing. He looked at Silas. "I'll take care of it," he said. "I know," Silas said. There was no more said about it. Cake was brought out. Tommy attempted to blow out the candles on Caleb's behalf and was physically redirected. Nora requested a corner piece on the grounds that corners had more frosting, a claim that Elsie disputed on mathematical grounds, and the evening continued in the way. Evenings continued at Blackwood Ranch, now which was loudly and imperfectly and with a fullness that had once been unimaginable in this house. Mara watched Caleb slip the knife into his pocket at the end of the evening carefully, with a care that was different from how he handled other things, and she thought about the boy who had walked into a blizzard in December, believing he was doing the right thing by leaving. She thought about how wrong he had been, and how understandable the wrongness was, and how the distance between December's Caleb and September's Caleb was not made up of any single event, but of 10,000 ordinary days, in which someone had repeatedly shown him, without declaration, that he was wanted here. Children don't heal from sustained fear because someone makes a speech. They heal because Tuesday is ordinary, and then Wednesday, and then a Thursday in September when a man gives them their grandfather's knife and says, "I'd like it to go to someone who'll use it the same way," and the weight of a year of careful, consistent reality finally tips the scale. She had seen it tip. She had watched it happen. She was not going to pretend it was complete. Caleb still carried things he might always carry, things that belonged to the year after Daniel, things that would surface later in ways neither of them could predict. He was a person, not a project. He would have his own hard years ahead, his own failures and recalibrations, the full ordinary difficulty of a life being lived. She could not protect him from that, and had stopped trying to, and was learning instead the harder skill of trusting him to navigate it. But tonight he was 13 and fed, and at a table surrounded by people who loved him, and in his pocket was a knife that had been given to him by a man who meant it, and that was real, and that was enough. October arrived, and the light changed again. Going golden and long the way Montana fall light goes, slanting across the ranch in the late afternoon with a particular warmth that felt like the land's version of looking back. 1 year. It had been almost exactly 1 year since she had driven a wagon north from Garrison with 4 children and a worn suitcase and 11 words of invitation folded soft with rereading. She thought about that woman. Sometimes the one standing at the gate in November, with everything she had fitting into a wagon. The one who had walked into Silas Blackwood's spare kitchen and looked for the catch in his kindness, because she had learned by then that kindness usually had one. She thought about her with something that was not quite pity and not quite pride, but something in between, the complicated feeling of recognizing a version of yourself that was doing the best it could with what it had. She had not been wrong to be afraid. The fear had been accurate to the situation, earned by real experience. It was not weakness. It was information. What she had been wrong about what she had slowly, resistingly, finally been forced to revise was the belief that the fear was the final word, that because things had gone wrong before, they would go wrong again. that the correct response to an open gate was to look for the trap rather than walk through. There was no way to know, from the outside, which open gates were traps and which were just open. She understood that. She was not naive about it, had not become naive. There were men like Harlan Briggs, and there always would be. Men who made offers and attached prices you didn't see until later, and the skill of recognizing them was real and worth keeping. But Silas Blackwood was not that, and she had almost walked away from him because she could not yet the difference. Not because she was foolish, but because she was human, and humans who have been hurt carry the hurt forward as a protection, and sometimes the protection is the thing that costs them most. She thought about this often. She thought about what it meant that her children had adapted faster than she had, that Nora had sat by his stove on the first night, and Tommy had been in the barn by the second day, and Caleb had thawed, by degrees, while she was still running calculations. Children had not learned yet to weaponize their own hope against themselves. They had not yet been taught that wanting something was a liability. She had learned that, and the learning had served her, and also cost her things, and both of those things were true. She was 41 years old. She had buried a husband and lost a house and driven north in November with nothing but the next thing in front of her. She had split wood until her wrists ached, and stood in a barn, holding a wire cutter she didn't know how to use, and faced a man in her kitchen who had tried to take what wasn't his, and done it calmly, because calm was the best tool available. And she was still here, still going. That was not a small thing. She wanted to say that clearly, for whoever was listening to this story in whatever future they occupied, surviving is not small. The ordinary persistence of a person continuing through hard things and making dinner and getting the children to sleep and getting up again in the morning and doing it again, that is not a minor heroism. The main one, the one that actually sustains the world. Harlan Briggs did not come back. She heard through Ruth that he had stepped back from the bank board following the inquiry from the county records office and had taken a quieter role in county affairs. She did not spend time thinking about him. Some antagonists don't get dramatic endings, they just become smaller, receding until the space they occupied fills with other things. Space he had occupied in her fear filled with other things. It was an evening in late October when she and Silas sat on the porch after supper, a thing they had begun doing. In September, when the evenings were still warm enough to be outside, and had continued doing past the point of warmth, because the habit had become something they wanted to keep. The sky was doing something complicated over the ridge. Clouds moving at different heights and directions, the last light cutting between them in long orange bars. Inside, she could hear the children. Tommy explaining something at length to an audience that may or may not have been listening. Nora's periodic contributions. Elsie's voice asking a question. Caleb's response, which she could not make out, but whose tone was easy, the relaxed, unguarded tone she had waited for, through all of last winter, and that was ordinary now. Ordinary. That was the word. She had forgotten to notice when it had become ordinary, which was exactly how it should happen. "I've been thinking," Silas said, "about the north pasture. The fence we did in December, I want to redo it properly in the spring. Do it right this time, not the winter version." She looked at the ridge. "That'll take most of a week. 2 weeks if we do the full line. But it's worth it. Caleb can help with the posts," she said. "He's gotten good at the post work." Silas nodded slowly. "I know." A silence. The comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't ask anything of you. Then Silas said, "You doing all right?" It was a question he asked periodically, not as a formality, but as a genuine check, and she had learned to answer it honestly rather than reflexively. She thought about it. "Yes," she said. "I'm doing all right. You were somewhere else tonight, after supper." "I was thinking about last year," she said, "about the drive up from Garrison." He was quiet. "I almost turned around," she said. "Creek Fork. I sat there for 10 minutes telling myself I was being ridiculous, driving to a stranger's ranch with 4 children." "What stopped you?" She considered. Caleb said, "Mom, the horse is getting cold." She paused. "So I drove on." Silas made a sound that was somewhere between a breath and a laugh. Good horse sense, he said. He didn't know what he was doing, she said. He was just stating a fact. Most of the things that matter happen that way, he said. Someone states a fact, and someone else acts on it, and later it looks like a decision. She looked at the side of his face. The last light was on it, warm and specific. Come inside, she said. Let the children eat. She paused. That's what you said. He looked at her. I remember. 8 words. 11, he said. I said, let the children eat, which is 4, plus come inside, which is 2, plus counted differently. You were tired. I was terrified. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I could see it. Were you? Terrified, he considered it. No. Nervous. It's different. He paused. I knew what I was offering was real. I wasn't sure you'd believe it. I didn't, she said. Not for a long time. I know that too. She looked at the sky. The orange had gone, and the blue was deepening toward dark, and the first stars were starting at the ridge. Do you regret it, she asked. Any of it. He did not rush the answer. That was one of the things she had come to rely on, the way he did not rush answers, did not give her the easy version to settle the question. No, he said, not any of it, even the hard parts, especially those, he said. The hard parts are the ones that tell you if a thing is real. She thought about that, about Caleb in the blizzard, and Harlan at the door, and the long February evenings, and the wood they'd split on the East Ridge, and every cold morning and tight calculation, and the 1,000 moments of friction and adjustment that came, with 6 people learning to live inside the same life. Real, yes. All of it had been real. Inside, something crashed, probably Tommy, and then Tommy's voice said, I'm fine with the practiced speed of someone heading off inquiry. And then Nora's voice said, you knocked over my horse with real indignation. And then Caleb's voice said, both of you stop. And there was a pause, and then relative quiet, and she could imagine exactly the scene without seeing it, and that familiarity was its own kind of abundance. I should go in, she said. Probably, he said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Silas. Yeah, thank you for opening the gate. He looked at her. You keep thanking me, he said. You opened a gate in November for a woman you'd never met, and 4 children you didn't know, she said. I'm going to keep thanking you for that. He was quiet for a moment. Then you thanked me by coming through it, he said. She looked at him. The stars were properly out now, the sky fully committed to night, and the light from the kitchen window was warm and yellow on the porch boards between them. That's a nice thing to say, she said. It's true, he said. She stood up. She put her hand on his shoulder for a moment, just that, just her hand on the familiar solidity of him, and then she went inside. The kitchen table had 6 chairs. This was a fact so ordinary now that no one commented on it anymore. It had been a fact since December, since Silas had pulled a chair from the back room and added it without ceremony during a supper. When the original 4 were not enough, and it had stayed a fact through winter and spring and summer, and into this October evening. 6 chairs. Not because anyone had decided to make a point of it, because 6 people lived here and needed somewhere to sit. Tommy was at the far end with the cat who had been named, after much negotiation, Thursday, because that was the day she had definitively moved inside, and was explaining something to the cat in the serious register he used for important communications. The cat's expression suggested she found this neither interesting nor offensive, which was approximately the cat's expression for all situations. Nora had retrieved her wooden horse from where it had fallen and was engaged in some kind of private narrative with it, her lips moving slightly. She did this every evening and had never disclosed the content of the narratives, and Mara had decided this was a thing a mother should let a child keep. Elsie was at the table with a letter she was composing. She had started writing to a girl she'd met on the supply run, to Garrison, the kind of correspondence that would sustain a friendship across the distance of frontier miles, and she approached it with the same seriousness she brought to everything written. Caleb was washing the supper dishes. He had started doing this in January once, without being asked, and had continued doing it since without comment or complaint, which was how Caleb absorbed things into his life quietly, through repetition, until the thing became simply what he did. Mara stood in the doorway from the porch and looked at all of them. She thought about something a woman had told her once. Years ago, before Daniel, before any of this, a neighbor who had 8 children and a husband who worked the river trade and was gone for long stretches, and whom Mara had asked, as a young woman without children, yet how she managed it, how she kept going through all of it. The woman had said, "You don't keep going. You just go. One day at a time is too big. You just go to the next thing, and then the next thing. And then you look up one day, and you've gone a long way from where you started." She had not understood that at the time. She understood it now. She had not built this life. She had gone to the next thing, and then the next, and then she had looked up in an October kitchen with 6 chairs and 4 children, and a man on the porch who had not promised her a perfect life and had delivered an honest one, and here she was. Here they all were. Starting over, she had learned, did not mean erasing. Daniel was in this room, in the way Caleb held a pencil, in the color of Elsie's eyes, in Tommy's particular laugh that had come entirely from his father. The past was not a place you left. It was something you carried forward, folded into everything you built after, present in ways that changed over time, but did not disappear. She had been afraid for a long time that loving Silas meant betraying Daniel, that choosing to be happy in a new life meant she had not sufficiently honored the life before. She had held that fear carefully for months, turned it over, examined it from every angle. What she had come to slowly was this: Daniel would have wanted her to go through the gate. He would have been the first one to tell her to drive on when the horse was getting cold. She knew that, not as a comfort she had manufactured, but as a fact about the man he had been: generous, practical, unable to imagine his family cold and afraid when there was a warm kitchen with the door open. She let herself know that without guilt. Caleb turned from the dishes and saw her in the doorway. "Everything okay?" he said. "Everything's fine," she said, just looking. He studied her for a second with the old instinct, then nodded and went back to the dishes. She came fully into the kitchen. She sat down at the table in her chair, at her end. She picked up the letter she'd been reading before supper, a note from Ruth about a spring gathering she was organizing, and she held it without reading it, and just sat there with her family around her. Silas came in from the porch a few minutes later. He hung his hat, poured himself a last cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, and he sat down in his chair at the other end of the table. The table between them held all of it. Elsie's letter in progress, Tommy's rock collection that migrated here, despite being officially banned from the kitchen table, Thursday the cat, who should not have been on any furniture and was on the bench, Nora's wooden horse that had walked its way across the wood to the edge, the remnants of supper, the lamp, the ordinary debris of a family in the middle of an evening. Silas looked at her across all of it. She looked back. She thought, this is the thing nobody tells you when you are standing at a gate in November with nothing left. They don't tell you that the other side of the worst thing is not a perfect life. It is a real one, muddy and loud and full of problems that need solving, and children who knock things over, and winters that are harder than expected, and cats who absorb themselves into your household without permission, and men who give you their father's knife and sit on cold porches asking if you're doing all right. Real, true, chosen. Not handed to them by luck or fate or anything so passive. Built, badly sometimes, slowly mostly, with the same tools that were already in their hands: stubbornness and practicality, and the refusal to stop going to the next thing. 6 chairs, 1 table. 6 people who had, separately and together, survived enough to find themselves here, which was the only victory that had ever mattered. The stove ticked. Thursday, the cat stood up, turned around once, and lay back down in a different configuration. Nora said something to her wooden horse. Caleb finished the dishes and dried his hands and sat down without ceremony, and Tommy showed everyone a new rock he had acquired from the yard and explained its qualities. At length, outside, the Montana night was doing what it did, enormous and dark and full of weather, indifferent to the small lights of human habitation scattered across its face. The wind was coming off the ridge. The cattle were in the south pasture. The horses were in the barn. And inside Blackwood Ranch, a family that had chosen each other sat around a table with 6 chairs, ordinary and imperfect and entirely, completely alive.